Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for Edible Inquiries, Evolved and Dissolved, a webinar hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. My name is Karen Bassarab, and I'm with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Food Policy Networks Project. On the screen with me today from the Center for a Livable Future also is Ann Palmer and Rachel Santos, who also work with the Food Policy Networks Project. The Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future is an interdisciplinary center located at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health. The Food Policy Networks Project is one of our projects with the goal to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do this through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials. If you aren't familiar with the Food Policy Networks Project, I encourage you to check out our website and to sign up for our listserv to hear about future webinars. Before we dive into our topic today, I want to go over briefly a few features of Zoom, the video conferencing and webinar system that we are using today. All attendees are muted and will remain in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. At any point during the conversation, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box. You can open the Q&A box on the floating toolbar. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any issues with sound or viewing the slides, send us a message via the chat box, also located on the floating toolbar. You can use the chat box also to share comments or resources or to let us know who's on the line with us today. We will be recording the webinar and we'll share the recording and slides after the presentation. Edible Inquiries, Evolved and Dissolved is our third webinar in the Edible Inquiries Food Policy Research Connection series. Each quarter, we invite researchers to share findings from their work on food policy groups. This series is part of a broader effort to connect researchers and food policy councils to foster research that is relevant, proactive, and responsive. Today's webinar was inspired by our experience observing changes in the purpose and structures of food policy councils over time. Sometimes councils will become temporarily inactive as they try to define themselves, or they may dissolve altogether. The speakers joining us today will talk about their experience with food policy councils in transition and what they learned about the sustainability of food policy councils. Our speakers today include Nicole DuBose, co-chair of the Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Food Policy Council. Nicole will share her experience working to revive the coalition. Nicole has over 15 years of experience working with organizations to strengthen families and communities through food access, sustainable collaboration, and community deliberation. Prior to joining Ohio State University Extension, Nicole worked for Cuyahoga County Health and Human Services, where she developed and managed many community-based programs and initiatives. Also joining us is Monica Cuneo, who will talk about the dissolution of the Portland-Multnomah County Food Policy Council in Oregon. Monica has 15 years of experience related to sustainable and community food systems, public health, and social determinants of health. She has worked with diverse stakeholders across diverse environments and geographic levels. Lastly, my colleague Rachel Santos will discuss her research that explores the instability of food policy councils and provide a broad look at the evolution and dissolution of food policy councils nationally. At the Center for a Livable Future, Rachel's work focuses on local and regional food governance, urban agriculture, institutional food procurement, and the relationship between diet and climate change. With that, I will turn it over to Rachel to frame the discussion with some reflection on the national context.
Thanks, Karen. So the research I'm going to be presenting today is actually based on research I did as part of my master's thesis a couple years ago. And I'm just going to give a broad overview. Let's see. Sometimes the PowerPoint can be a little slow. Okay, hold on one second. It's Microsoft PowerPoint shut down, so I have to restart it. Okay. Apologize for that. Let's hope that it goes smoothly from here. Okay, so like I said, this is from some research I did a few years ago as part of my master's thesis. So I'm going to give you some background on the research that I did, and then dive into some relevant findings to our conversation today about the evolution and dissolution of food policy councils. And finally, I'll finish with some key takeaways that can help frame the work that Nicole and Monica will be sharing. Oh, goodness. Okay. So I'm going to try it one more time, and if it doesn't work, maybe we'll try to get Nicole or Monica to share from their side, and we'll see if that works. All right, so the goal that I had of this research project was to study how local food policy groups like food policy councils and other similar groups are connecting through networks, what I call translocal networks, so working across different jurisdictions and localities to come together, network, share good practices, and learn from one another. And so I did this through a comparative analysis of the food policy networks, which is, as you're familiar with, based here in the US. And there's a similar group called the Sustainable Food Cities Network in the UK. So I was looking into both of these different networks. And when I use the term local food policy group, I'm referring to both food policy councils, but also the many other groups that are used that have different names, but are basically multi-stakeholder, place-based groups that work to make their food systems healthier, more equitable, and more sustainable. Sometimes they go by names like food councils, food coalitions, committees, food policy task force, food alliances. In Europe, the most common term in the UK is actually food partnership, but there's similar food policy boards and steering groups as well. And so I use the term local food policy group to encompass all of these different groups. And I was looking at how these local food policy groups come together and relate to one another through these translocal networks like the Food Policy Networks Project and Sustainable Food Cities Network. How are they using these networks to share ideas, and how do those ideas help shape their practices and policies on the ground in different places? And one look I was looking at is, what is the role of these larger networks in building more sustainable and just food systems? Are these networks something that we could help scale food system reform up from local place-based initiatives to more regional, national, and international levels? And could they help scale these food system reforms out to other municipalities? And I did this through participant observation in both Food Policy Networks Project and Sustainable Food Cities Network member and advisory group meetings. As you're probably familiar, I've been part of the staff here at the FPN for several years, and so I was able to use a participant observation approach to this research. And I also analyzed listserv archives like the FPN archive and the Sustainable Food Cities Network listserv archive, as well as websites, resources, and then I interviewed 22 people across both networks to see their experiences. And so what I'm going to share with you today is actually less about the broader networks. I just wanted to give you some context of where this research is coming from, and more on the dynamic nature of local food policy groups that came out as a result of learning about how they're connecting with one another. Let's hope that it advances. I'm sorry, it's being slow, but I want to hope that it won't kick me off again to PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay, so firstly, sorry, I advanced a lot of the slides. All right, so this is a figure that I made as part of the thesis, but it's familiar to many of you. You'll see the rise of food policy councils. In blue is the rise of groups. Sorry, Karen is going to start sharing from her screen, and hopefully that will work better. In blue, you can see the rise of food policy councils in similar groups in the US. And you can see a comparable rise of groups in Canada. The UK is in green. Other countries, you'll notice, have really shot up in the past few years, and that's in large part due to the signing of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which includes a recommendation to form food policy councils and similar groups. And there's also several others in different countries, as well as state and regional networks. So I was kind of tracking how the development of these translocal networks, like Food Policy Networks Project, is tracking along with the rise of local food policy groups. But I think what's missing from this chart that we often share around is, like, look at how many groups are starting to form, and it's a growing movement of food policy councils at the local level. And what's missing is the fact that these groups aren't the most stable entities, and that there's groups that are coming as well as leaving the national and international scene each year. And so, Karen, if you could advance just one. Thanks. So, like I said, it obscures their dynamic composition, their sometimes temporality, and their fluidity. So next slide, please. And so that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about with you all today, is that when we do the census each year with the Food Policy Networks Project, it's actually really quite hard to characterize even the very existence of local food policy groups, because just to decide when they start forming, do you count their year of formation from the moment they start talking about forming a food policy group, or the moment that several people get together and actually form some type of written piece of paper, or even something as formal as bylaws? Or is it something even broader, like government has officially declared the Food Policy Council active? Sometimes these membership and initiation conversations can take several years. And so even just demarking when a group starts in this chart can be challenging. But then on top of that, you have fluctuating census counts. So each year we removed about 20 local food policy groups from the directory, and another 30 each year enter a period of hiatus, or what we call questionable status, because we haven't been able to respond. We haven't heard any response from them. Their webpage might not be up to date. And so we have to make judgment calls along the way of, do we count this group as active or do we not? And some of those inactive groups end up reemerging after a period of transition. But as of August 2018, another 120 groups, to our knowledge, are still inactive, but have existed at some point over the past 20 years. So when you're looking at the chart that I was showing before, that's not very clear that a lot of groups have also left the scene, and that might be obscured by the fact that we have other groups forming in different areas. And even if the groups don't officially dissolve, there are also many that undergo significant internal restructuring. And so in our most recent survey of 2018, about 12% of US and Canadian food policy councils reported being in a state of transition, where they're redefining their purpose or redefining their structure. And so I just thought that was important to highlight, that there's a lot of these transitions going on, whether it's due to leadership or membership changes, changes in funding, changes in the political climate, either at the local level or their state level, or even federal sometimes, and also the priorities of the members on the council. Karen, would you mind? Actually, I think I can share the poll. So I wanted to do a quick poll. Okay, I guess all the questions showed up at once. So if you could just do the first question, you see it. I'm not sure what everyone sees because I see the whole poll result. Okay, we'll go ahead and end the poll now. And we'll just talk about the results from the first one, and we'll relaunch it when Nicole and Monica go. But it looks like about a third of the people on this call have successfully transitioned their structure at some point. Another almost third are currently in a transition period, and another third are either considering it or have a stable structure that works for them. So thanks for taking that, and we'll continue sharing those results in the rest of the webinar. Okay, and so to continue on this theme of other things that might be missing from the conversation is that a lot of groups, there's no clearly defined membership for a lot of food policy councils and other food policy groups. So they might have varying memberships built into their structure. Some consider all of their members to be everyone who's on their listserv, but that they might not ever, all their listserv subscribers might not attend any or most of their meetings. Others have some organization representatives and citizens who sometimes attend meetings, and then sometimes there are participants who attend almost every meeting and participate in working groups or steering committees. And for a small number of councils, there's also paid staff members. So these memberships vary greatly across councils and within councils, and so sometimes it can be challenging to define who actually sits on a food policy council and how to share who they are with other people. That said, the loose and fluctuating memberships allows members to participate according to their availability, their interest, and experience. And I like the quote at the bottom from one of the people I had interviewed. I use the term network loosely. We have a governance group, but no official membership. And if you could continue the slide. So beyond just the members on councils, there's also a lot of relationships between food policy councils and other groups. And so this is a schematic that I created to kind of talk about the fluid interactions that local food policy groups have with others beyond their immediate memberships. And so these can be kind of hard to define because some food policy councils and groups are more focused on the work that they're doing at their level. Others are very engaged with their neighboring local food policy councils in other cities in their state. Some are really engaged in their state food policy group or even at the food policy networks project level and talk to us a lot. Some have no engagement whatsoever with other local food policy groups or state ones, but they work with other networks like the State Farm Food Hub Network or the Farmers Union or the Farm to School Network. And so it's important to highlight how important these relationships are to most of the work of local food policy groups. These are fundamental and not just tangential elements of their work. But when we're defining who food policy council groups are, sometimes we leave out the fact that they are so intertwined with other networks at so many different scales and levels that it can be challenging to define these interactions and to use those to our advantage. So next slide, please. So the key takeaways I just wanted to present from this part of the research is that food policy councils are very dynamic in their structure and their membership, and also in how long they exist and in which forms they exist in. And the benefits of this dynamic structure is that they can adapt to be relevant to policymakers, to funders, to the general public's opinion about different issues. It builds in resilience for them to survive changes in political or economic support. And a really great quote I had highlighted here in blue is, "We kept reshuffling ourselves so we could take a hit and be resilient, a big goal after the governor took away the first council. Then we thought, we'll get this legislated to live forever." And that didn't work. So we said, why aren't we thinking about this as less rigid and less institutional and more living up to what we can in the moment? And so again, it highlights the fact that local food policy groups can build flexible alliances outside of their scope of traditional memberships and be dynamic and resilient in the face of changing environments around them. That said, it can also present some limitations, and this can make it hard for some groups to survive these transition periods in structure and membership, in part because having dynamic memberships may make it difficult for council members to develop long-term relationships, both with each other on the council, as well as with external people, like, for instance, local government staff and policymakers. If the people who are comprising the council are constantly changing or changing every couple of years, it can be hard to keep track of who to talk to on the council and where to go from there. And it can sometimes restrict groups' abilities to compose a collective voice to advocate for change at higher levels. So if groups are having a hard time stabilizing their own structure, it can be challenging to work together with other groups who also may be going through similar transitory structures to work together to advance state level legislation, or even potentially work on farm bill legislation or something like that. So just wanted to present this broad scope of the structure, membership, transitory nature of food policy councils so that we can learn more from Nicole and Monica next. So I'll hand it over to Nicole now.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see it okay? Okay. So my name is Nicole DeBose. I share the co-chair position of our Cleveland-Cuyahoga Food Policy Coalition with Darcy Friedman, who is at Case Western Reserve's Prevention Research Center. The mission of the Cleveland-Cuyahoga Food Policy Coalition is to promote a just, equitable, healthy, and sustainable food system in the city of Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, and Northeast Ohio. I'll begin my discussion of our coalition in the performing stage and conclude in the norming stage. FPC was established in 2007. It was convened by the Cleveland Department of Public Health, excuse me, in partnership with Case Western Reserve, the New Agrarian Center, and Ohio State University Extension. Between 2007 and 2012, the coalition had over 30 accomplishments. Those accomplishments include a food waste audit that contributed to a composting program at the West Side Market, the Gardening for Greenbacks program, which assists entrepreneurs that are seeking to do urban farming as a for-profit venture, a community conversations toolkit to assess food gaps, as well as a community food guide. In 2013, the group decided to embark on a strategic planning process. This was, we're pretty successful pretty quickly, and it was kind of the time to take a step back to establish a framework that included strategic direction, goals, and objectives to guide our work over the next 10 to 15 years. In 2015, so we had a transition period, right, between 2013 and 15. So we distributed a survey to the community to help us figure out if the community even wanted an FPC. In 2016, that was the beginning of the formation of our current steering committee and our current structure. And then in 2017, that's when we launched our new steering committee and convening model. As I mentioned, we had, great successes between 2007 and 2012. One example is our Urban Garden District Ordinance that was approved in 2007 by the City of Cleveland. Locally, it's known as the Chicken and Bee Ordinance. This ordinance ensures that community gardens, market gardens, and greenhouses are properly located and protected. This ordinance was also one of the first in an urban area to include compost bins, chicken coops, and hives, and hence the Chicken and Bee Ordinance. Mm-hmm. In order to help the City of Cleveland and partner agency organizations serve the healthiest possible choices to Cleveland residents, our Food Policy Coalition partnered with the City of Cleveland, the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, Cleveland Clinic, and other organizations to create healthy guidelines for foods purchased and served. Those guidelines serve as a part of the City of Cleveland's Healthy Cleveland initiative and are based on the USDA's 2010 Healthy Guidelines. So in late 2012, 2013, the coalition reached the transforming stage, and as I mentioned, embarked on a strategic planning process that included conversations around our mission and structure. At that time, the FPC had paid staff that included 1.5 FTEs. In 2015, due to staff changes and eventually changes in funding, we found ourselves in that lingering transition phase with the transitions committee that was made up of a handful of FPC members. The Transitions Committee was charged with reviewing the mission structure and community interest in having an FPC. During this time, we took a step back to remind ourselves of the purpose of food policy coalitions and asked what an FPC in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County would and should look like. We decided to keep the original mission, which was established in 2007. And so this was one of the questions that was a part of our community survey. This was one of the questions that motivated us and encouraged us that the community did want the FPC and would actually be engaged in it. So you'll see that 84% indicated that they were very interested or somewhat interested in being actively engaged in the FPC moving forward. Another question we asked was, how important is it for there to be an organized coalition around food access and local foods? You'll see here that 95% responded that it is very important or important. As we entered the forming stage, we had to answer questions every coalition asks at some point. Do we want to be formal or informal? Do we want paid or unpaid staff? Who will do what? When will who do what? Do we want to establish requirements for membership? Do we want officers? And when will we meet? With the help of a consultant, we recognize that every coalition has a unique structure that's determined by the goals and resources of the group. Some coalition structures are more formal than others. One coalition may have paid staff, for example, while others are dependent on volunteer leaders. Even though we were in it, it was good to take a step back and hear from another, like an outside person, that the coalition structure did not need to be complex, but taking the time to develop the structure was important because we needed clearly defined roles and procedures to move forward. With a decrease in funding, we decided to implement a structure dependent on volunteers. So our current structure includes 2 co-chairs, steering committee members, and each of us have 2-year terms. The co-chairs and steering committee members are voted into their roles after an application and interview process. I guess we could say that if we did have a storming process, that may have been when that occurred, but the members who were at the table were honestly more interested in rebuilding the coalition than turf issues. So that was a good thing for us as leaders. So we had to decrease in funding. So we decided, like I said, to implement a structure dependent on volunteers. So anyone can consider themselves a member of the coalition if they attend at least one of our convenings a year. Our convenings are held twice a year. The FPC fellow position was created after the steering committee members grew to appreciate not only the level of interest in volunteering for the coalition, but the need for administrative support and our responsibility as a coalition to foster the next generation of food system advocates. This position is also filled through an application and interview process, has a school year-based 1-year term, and this position is also not paid. So we aim to have equal representation from each sector in the food system. We struggle, though, with attaining representation from the production and processing sectors. This is due in part to the fact that local farmers often hold full-time jobs during the day, and our meetings and our convenings are held during business hours. We identify the standing committees of convening, fundraising, and advocacy because of the ongoing needs. So we, like I mentioned, we have 2 convenings a year. Even though we are volunteer right now, in 2019, we said we would move towards having deeper conversations around fundraising, and then of course, advocacy. So each working group, you'll see them listed: advocacy, communications, membership, and an Ohio Food Policy Network liaison, has a chairperson that's responsible for ensuring task completion, as well as reporting out during our quarterly or bi-monthly FPC steering committee meetings. Each meeting is hosted by a different steering committee member at their office or a location within the community. You might notice from the last 2 slides that our model does not include any programming. So in 2016, after meeting with local organizations that also, at least in part, focus on the local food system and reviewing their missions and areas of work, we saw that none of the other groups focused solely on advocacy. So by making the decision to focus solely on advocacy, our work is unique and positions us to play a supportive instead of competitive role amongst our partner organizations. This also makes our steering committee meeting agenda topics different from some of the other committees that many of the FPC steering committees sit on, right? So we would go from meeting to meeting, similar agenda items, and it was like, well, how can we stop duplicating conversations? So this was our opportunity to, at least on our end, have a unique agenda. So I'm going to ask a question. How many of the FPCs on this call coordinate programs, support advocacy efforts, or a combination of both? I think Rachel has the polling question. Are you already answered it, maybe?
So yes, it seems the poll got all shared at once,
Okay.
all the questions. So I'm just gonna, if you scroll, you can see your second question there, the answer.
Okay, so many do a combination of both. That's good. In the coordinating programs and projects. So I think, in future conversations, as we continue conversations around structures, I would love to hear and learn more about how those who coordinate programs only, how that works out, and how your structure, right, benefits or contributes to the success of your coalition. Okay. So I mentioned the survey that we disseminated in 2015 to gauge community interest and value in the FPC. So in 2016, we sent out another survey asking the community to help us identify our 2017, kind of going into 18 policy priorities. So we did focus on food waste and healthy food access for the majority of I think part of 2017, but most of 2018. We took those results and developed them into policy priorities with specific outcomes. And due to the renewal of the Farm Bill, we added that as a third priority and offered a Farm Bill advocacy training in June of this year. During our upcoming November meeting, we'll identify our 2019 policy priorities. So after approximately 2 years of transition, happy to say that with support from the community, the FPC is back in the performing stage. Moving forward, we plan to secure greater representation from the production and processing community members, continue with our current volunteer leadership model, seek funding for staff, meeting space, and maybe speaker honorariums. And then our fellow has begun to work on our website. So if you visited our website recently, we're probably one of those that Rachel referenced that has some pretty outdated information. So we're going to work on that. As I conclude my presentation and get ready for Monica, I want to leave you with a few closing thoughts and recommendations. Keep your community engaged and involved in decision-making, right? They will be your advocates and supporters as your community needs, political climates, and funding shifts occur. Be patient and allow the stages to run their course. We were in our transition phase for 2 years. In hindsight, the group needed the majority of that time to reassess, regroup, and restructure. Our most recent successes make that 2 years seem like a drop in the bucket. Definitely didn't feel like that at that time. Mm-hmm. If your FPC decides to offer programming, make sure the funding is not tied to the FPC. That's one of the reasons we were in our transition phase for so long. Keep the operational funding separate from the programmatic funding. So thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. Monica, do you want to take the floor?
Sure do. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me pull up my presentation here. All right, so I'm going to share a bit about some research that myself and another woman conducted in 2012. I was a member of the Food Policy Council, which I will refer to from here on forward as the PMFPC, which stands for the Portland Multnomah Food Policy Council, between January of 2011 to December of 2012. So it was about 2 years, and at which point the council dissolved. And after the dissolution of the council, several people, members and community members alike, were left scratching their heads, wondering what happened and why did this happen. And so Amy, my fellow researcher, and I sought out to use the dissolution of the council to the advantage of the broader field while the transition was still fresh in people's minds. So we designed and conducted this research really to just understand more. I want to be transparent in saying that my involvement on the council and the relationships that I held, both with the staff liaisons, the membership at the time, as well as past membership, absolutely influenced all stages of the research, including the design, the questions, and the analysis. And Amy was really serving as a counterbalance from an outsider perspective to make sure that we were being as open to what we were hearing as possible. Let's see, advance. There we go. So as I mentioned, we were looking for answers. And so as a means of breaking down and unpacking this desire for broader understanding of the reasons for the dissolution, we were curious about the roles, benefits, and consequences of public participation in the policy process broadly, and the role of public participation in the creation of food-related policies specifically. So we're asking questions about the factors that led to the dissolution of the PMFPC, and what aspects did what we found, what were shared with what was happening nationally. And then finally, to build on that, what were the lessons learned from the PMFPC that we could generalize and would be helpful for other food policy councils' work moving forward nationally. So I conducted 10 semi-structured interviews using a purposive sampling frame. We recruited interviewees who were present during various stages of the lifetime of the PMFPC, so including its formative years, its dissolution, and really every stage in between. And interviewees represented the diversity of stakeholder roles on the PMFPC, including former members and chairs, city and county staff liaisons, longtime supporters who tracked the work of the council, in addition to being active in food systems work in the area. And we cross-analyzed interview transcripts as well as meeting minutes and other PMFPC formative documents using the deduced qualitative coding software. So it's important before we dive into some of the council specifics to just get grounded in the food culture of Portland. Portland, Oregon has been on the map for years as a leader in the sustainable food movement, and as I can speak to, legitimate foodie haven and heaven. It's the largest city in an agriculturally abundant state. It has a year-round growing season. There's seafood and viticulture that attracts innovative chefs from really all over the world. There's an abundance of farmers markets, community gardens, urban farms, food-related nonprofits. There's an enormous food cart and food entrepreneurial scene. There's also a political climate of progressive food and land use policies that support small-scale hobby backyard growers to have goats, chickens, bees, and small gardens that can sell overflow product regionally. And Portland's also a leader in citizen engagement. There are over 70 citizen boards, commissions, and councils hosted by either the city or Multnomah County, or both through joint commissions and committees. So where did the PMFPC fit into all of this? So as I'm sure many of folks on the call are aware of, FPCs, while they're similar in their general mission and commitment to transforming the local food system, and that they are a part of, they often vary in structure, function, governance, and accountability structures. So in general, though, our research found that they fall into 3 primary categories: as governmental, which are FPCs that operate within government agencies as food policy commissions, task forces, or advisory boards, and tend to have very limited decision-making power in terms of policy making. And they're also limited in their ability to advocate from the position of the council. There's nonprofits or independent FPCs that have no government affiliation and can seek funding and support from outside sources. And then there's the hybrid or quasi-governmental FPCs that have melded the two models to create organizations with government support and partnership, but the government role and partnership doesn't have control. So the PMFPC was a governmental FPC, and it was served as an advisory board. It was initiated via a community forum in 2002 to meet really broad stakeholder needs at the time. And participants at this forum saw benefit in establishing a formalized relationship with municipal government, and municipal government also shared this view. And so it became a joint advisory board between the city and the county, and this was part of its failure, a subcommittee of a different commission called the Sustainable Development Commission. So this joint appointment afforded the council with 2 staff liaisons, at least 2, one from the city and at least 1 from the county. And through various times throughout its lifespan, it had 2 or 3 people from the county, depending on the department. So the resolution that made the PMFPC binding city and county policy was drafted and passed in May of 2002, and it stated the council's initial charges, which were such as providing ongoing advice on food issues, developing governing principles, and to develop a work plan for the fiscal year 2003-2004. So as is probably obvious, these charges documented in the group charter as its initial charge became quickly irrelevant as they were immediately accomplished as a means of just creating the operating frameworks of the council. And that these formative documents were never updated to reflect accomplished initial steps and to set the strategic direction for ongoing impact, which is a point we'll come back to. So during its time, it was around for about 10 years, they achieved many successes. These are just some of the, just a handful, but developed the Multnomah Food Action Plan, which was a 15-year plan to improve the county's food system. They launched the Healthy Retail Initiative, which is a program that continues to operate within the county that provides funding and technical assistance to create infrastructure improvements for healthy corner stores. Beginning Urban Farmer Apprentice Program, which trains new farmers using county land, and changes to the Urban Food Zoning Code, which is likely similar to what Nicole mentioned as well. So with these achievements, what went wrong? So in September of 2012, the county chair at the time, Jeff Cogan, who was speaking to some of Rachel's points, was an appointer. So the county chair and the mayor both appointed members to the council. He joined the council meeting to announce that because this joint committee, the Sustainable Development Commission, which was the advisory board that the PMFPC existed as a subgroup of, dissolved in 2007, they also unintentionally dissolved the PMFPC. And because the resolution was never revised, it essentially left the PMFPC motherless and therefore technically no longer existed. This was a huge surprise to everybody in the room. And while this was the official reasoning put forth, members really questioned this. And from the research and the conversations that we had, it became obvious that council members and staff had been sensing the dissolution for some time prior to it actually occurring. So what were they considering and what was going wrong? The interviews unveiled 2 main themes of disparate perspectives, which was then corroborated through additional research from the field. Overall, there was a lack of agreement regarding the role and function of citizens in the policy process, as well as a lack of agreement regarding the role and function of government in facilitating public participation in policy process. And this discrepancy led to the dissolution, represented the fallout from these 2 broad themes. So let's unpack these a little bit. So one of the struggles was this lack of autonomy, authority, and influence. So staff and members had differing opinions of how issues should rise to the surface as most important. Some staff wanted to use a top-down approach by taking priority issues on the radar of the electeds and then asking for council support. While several members preferred identifying key issues based on the fields and areas that they work in, and then advocating or finding means to reach electeds with the support and guidance from the staff liaisons. There was a sense from members that they didn't have access to electeds, or there was a lot of gatekeeping going on, nor were their priority concerns being represented by the liaisons accurately. These differences in approaches led to overall frustration amongst both groups, which served to fuel this narrative of irrelevance. There was a huge gap and an absence in strategic planning and communications. So like any organization, coalition, initiative, FPCs require well-designed organizational structures, strategic planning, and evaluation processes to remain productive and sustainable over time and to generate a sense of reflective learning and growth. And Nicole spoke really well to how well that energized the work of her Food Policy Council. But the Portland-Multnomah Food Policy Council lacked any formalized strategic planning schedule, which contributed to its inability to participate in and develop long-term and short-term strategy development, as well as build in opportunities for any type of course correction. There was also growing tension between the city and county staff, which in reflection was likely due to personality conflicts, but nevertheless got in the way of the group's success and produced a lot of infighting and competition and increasing gatekeeping. So all combined, these got in the way of the council developing and maintaining a shared vision and strategic direction, nor having opportunities for reflection and improvement. So I had a poll question, and it looked like there were about 18 responses. So wondering, how many of you out there have strategic planning scheduled in your council? So it looks like it's exactly half and half. About half of you have it scheduled and half of you don't. So I recommend that for those who don't, that one of the things you take away from this phone call is the importance of building that into your work. So the next piece that was a big struggle was the overall lack of training and capacity building for members. And also, whose role was it to provide this capacity building? So members came into the process with a very different expectation than what city staff and elected officials expected of the group. So that's a big implication, but members also didn't have the training they needed to be most effective to live up to the expectations of some of the staff liaisons and electeds. So throughout the interviews, lack of capacity amongst members was named as an obstacle in being able to effectively engage with making policy recommendations, keeping up to date on policy-related activities, identifying what is considered even a potential food systems topic, understanding the processes involved in public policy making, and understanding the parameters inherent in serving on an advisory board, which are several. And then the other piece to this is, whose role is it to train and educate new members? So former staff liaisons stress the importance of developing a common understanding of the policy process in order to really create that level playing field for members, so that the advice of council members who were well versed in policy were not automatically privileged over those who were less experienced in policymaking but had equal capacity and expertise to develop recommendations. So my second question for the group is, who is responsible for capacity building training in your FPC? Okay, so interesting. This is similar in that half of you say that nobody is responsible. And then the other half is split up between government staff, council staff, and then a few of you mentioned somebody else. Rachel, is it possible to read who those somebody else's are?
Yeah, so we asked people to write it into the chat box. Let me see if anything. I don't see anyone had written it in, but
okay.
You're
That's
welcome.
okay.
Everyone's welcome to write in if somebody else. Oh, Noelle has written in and said, our FPC steering committee members are responsible for training and capacity building. Aaron Gallagher says AmeriCorps Vista is responsible for it.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm glad that somebody else. Somebody is. So then the final point. Actually, a couple more. This confusion around policy, not confusion necessarily, but I think it was actually showing up more as interest between policy versus projects versus programming. So members had kind of different levels of interest as well as understanding, which led to frustration among some of the staff members and staff liaisons, as members were often drawn to projects because they were tangible and something that they could see immediate products from, such as participation in leading community workshops, leading listening sessions, and participating in neighborhood meetings, for example, because the members felt that participation in these realms increased the relevance of the council to the broader community, which at the time, it felt like a kind of a exclusive group. And it also kept the council fresh and apprised to the community's priority concerns. So along those lines, and in reference to community representation, overall the council lacked racial and cultural diversity, and also really wrestled with the value of making a seat at the table for people with lived experience and life expertise. So while specific expertise may be needed in certain technical content areas, interviewees and the research really support the perspective that in food policy, expertise can be more broadly and loosely defined in order to encourage broader public engagement and the inclusion of those with lived experience in developing policies, projects, and programs that are designed to meet their needs. And that when the term expertise is narrowly defined, it tends to limit participation and lacks the interpretation of community knowledge as being equally legitimate. So this point was really hot on the table at the time of the dissolution and didn't have the chance to be resolved fully by the members, though there were several interviewees that named it as another point that drove a wedge between the liaison and member priorities. So all of these factors combined led to the council just continually losing relevance in the community. The food systems movement had matured significantly since the council began in 2002, with new organizations cropping up locally as well as nationally that were taking on single aspects of what had initially been conceived of as a package deal when the council began. And much of the original charges laid out for the FPC had been institutionalized in full-time staff positions within the city and or the counties. And overall, the food systems staff in both of these jurisdictions were increasingly preferring ad hoc committees set to task to answer technical questions related to potential policies and programs they were interested in implementing versus an advisory board with more general, undefined advice and duties. So now what? So no one interviewed mentioned a desire for reinvigorating the council as it was. More, there was an interest in searching for new alternatives. The county at the time of dissolution expressed the desire to pause for reflection and to lay out a clear path forward, and eventually did recruit and appoint professionals to serve on what was called the Food Advisory Board, or FAB, but it fizzled after about 6 or so months of meetings. Longtime council participants and some past members launched the Portland Area Food Forum, or PAF, but without dedicated staff to coordinate, it also fizzled. Generally speaking, food access and food security issues has been integrated into efforts at addressing the social determinants of health within organizations, as well as county health department and state health authorities. The city of Portland continues with a food program, though it's far less public, and is also being cross-tied and cross-connected with other issues such as climate change. And organizations continue to develop and administer programming, though the funding environment here, and I'm sure is similar in some of your communities, is far less interested in food systems topics, unless they are tied to other issues, resulting in the shuttering of some food-related organizations and the strategic redirection of others. And all in all, there is no central entity working to further food policy in the area. So finally, my recommendations, or our recommendations, are to conduct robust strategic planning and evaluation of roles, structures, and processes, and build timelines that ensure course corrections are built into the process. And just as Rachel mentioned in her presentation, prepare to be nimble and update strategies that reflect the changing context and the broader environment that the council exists within, to ensure resilience of the group. Conduct policy literacy and capacity building trainings. Make sure everyone at the table is at least beginning at the same page and with minimum shared understanding. And I should say that this probably is more relevant to groups that have a solid membership versus some of the network examples that Rachel shared, where, and that Nicole shared, where you have more of a governance body, but the membership may be as broad as a listserv. Clearly define the role of the council, its members, liaisons, and elected officials. So update these roles as new needs emerge or fall off, and make this check-in a part of the annual process included in strategic planning. Foster open communication and shared understanding of roles and responsibilities, and be transparent and build in mechanisms that allow for friendly accountability amongst participants in the spirit of reaching optimal impact. Define expertise and who should be represented to ensure the work of the council is relevant to priority groups and has the chance to achieve the impact in ways that it says that it's intending to. And along those lines, ensure robust community engagement to gain input from a diverse constituency, and save at least one seat at the table for someone with lived experience, and make resources available for their participation. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you, Nicole. We now have time to open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. Also, you can type them into the chat box as well. Thank you both for going over and sharing your experiences with the council. Monica, I wanted to ask you a question about the Portland Council. Some of the things that you shared in terms of, you know, that it kind of lost its relevancy. Part of that was that there were institutionalized positions within some of these organizations, and it sounded like within the city, which seemed like they would have been a good outcome and something that the council would strive for. So to me, it feels like with a nonprofit, they kind of they achieved their mission, and so then they went away. But it sounds like they were still struggling to find what was that next step for them. Do you think that there is this kind of way that councils can work themselves out of existence and like they achieve their mission and then they're done?
I think that's a yes and. That yes, that could be a win, right? And like you said, that's an outcome that I think we all hope for, that positions become institutionalized, that there's jurisdictional funding, and that shows a level of commitment by the jurisdictions and potentially electeds in ensuring that there are food-related policies and resolutions built into work moving forward, and that there's people to manage that. I think that the piece that's missing still is the ongoing opportunity for community members and or advocates and or experts and or interested parties to be able to continue to shape the agenda of those decision makers. And I think had the council had more touch points along the way to say, all right, we've created a win. This was one of our goals. And if it was even an explicit goal, this was a goal that we wanted to achieve and we've achieved it. Now what? Okay, let's keep reaching and aiming for the stars, and so we can keep growing. And I think because there wasn't some of that transparent goal setting, yes, it's a great thing, and there's still opportunity to do more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole, we have a question for you, and I'm going to read this description first. So Erin types in that we're a network with a dynamic governance structure and are young. They just completed their first year of a security plan. But some of these things sound like they could potentially happen for their council. They're new to policy. They have a varied group of members from city, county, civil society, business, and more. Do you have ideas on how networks like theirs, young, with diverse membership, could buffer against some of these pitfalls? And also, could you review the takeaways from successfully navigating the policy advocating process?
Okay. I think if I reflect on our process, I agree with your thought, right, with Monica's group, that to have that position institutional based, right, could be seen as a success. I think one of the ways we prevented or buffered against that was, again, to create a niche for ourselves. And so that's why we decided to focus on advocacy, because if you think about government organizations, often they can't participate in some advocacy efforts, right? So even I talked about our Farm Bill advocacy training that we held in June. Extension is funded by the Farm Bill, right? We have steering committee members who are also employed by government entities. And so that's a time when we had to say, we're taking a break. And then we could make this call as a personal, right, on behalf of ourselves. And so I think identifying an opportunity, an activity, something that the government based entities cannot fulfill, if they need that grassroots on the ground support to achieve, then that's a way to buffer. The second question is about reviewing takeaways. I think that identifying a champion early on is super important, and also presenting the benefits of how that implementing that policy could offset costs for local government. Right. For example, we talked a lot about chronic diseases, right? I think you did, Rachel, and how, or maybe it was you, Monica, sorry, and how, local food access, healthy eating offsets the costs and incidence, right, of chronic disease. So that was one of our ways to do that, to help get some of those ordinances passed. Off the top of my head, I would say identify a champion, present how the policy could benefit the bottom line of that city or county entity.
Thank you. And another question for both of you. We hear from councils oftentimes about this question of inclusivity and how do you include people with diverse backgrounds or with lived experiences in councils so that it's not just professionals sitting at the table. So are there certain strategies or ways that you've approached this that other councils could learn from?
You want to take a shot at that, Monica?
Sure. I'm thinking to the Oakland Food Policy Council, and this isn't really fresh in my memory, but one of the things I think that they do is rotate the location of their meetings. So one barrier that we had here was that the meetings were always held downtown and they were in City Hall. So right there are two huge barriers for people to feel, for some people to feel comfortable attending those meetings, and just I think being able to find transportation. So how do you make the physical access, improve physical access by just rotating around different parts of the city so that it's accessible to people in their neighborhoods. Holding it in times that, I think this is up for debate, but, at times during the day that people tend to work, then hold it after hours if they can't get paid to attend. And if they, or if there are parents considering opportunities for childcare and other ways to remove barriers for for them to participate. Definitely having financial benefit, because so many people are paid to participate via their roles. So having money to pay for participation. One thing that was a piece of the membership criteria within the PMFPC was that if you did not, I think you had to attend 9 out of 12 meetings, and if you didn't, you were asked to leave. Loosening up some of those structures and providing even times in the agenda that, maybe some decisions need a quorum and they need, really a certain type of membership, but allowing for opportunities and agendas and even in other types of decision making that allows for people who can come when they can, and allow for, not as strict of rules for being kicked off if they're not participating. Do you have any to add, Nicole?
I agree with you. The time of day and making those participants who aren't with an organization, right, but representing themselves or part of the ag community just feel part of the conversation. Often they're intimidated, unfortunately, by some of the names or, level, if you will, of the organizations at the table. And so it's our job to make them feel comfortable and maybe even provide, think about capacity building and training, right? Provide them with those opportunities, teach them our jargon and things like that so that they are comfortable and can actively participate in conversations.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to keep on this line of community. Nicole, you mentioned surveys to get a sense of community's desire for a council. The question is, how did you reach the community and what kind of response did you get in your surveys?
So we used our listserv. At that, when we sent the first and second surveys out, we were still kind of figuring it out, right? So we didn't necessarily have that core of active members. And so we used our listserv and asked people to forward the second survey that asked about community interest. We asked others to forward it to people who might be interested, and that would be able to, I won't say appropriately, but if they hadn't been involved in the FPC before, it was like, how could we ask them if they want to be engaged in the future? But then sometimes we did have some who had not been engaged and were interested and said that, like, we've never been engaged. We didn't even know this group existed. And so, yes, we would love to be involved in the future. You had another question.
What did you learn from the responses?
I think we primarily learned, like I presented, that there is an interest, right? And that our work was not for naught, that, what we were doing and spending those 2 years and meeting once a month, if not more, that we were doing something that the community wanted us to do. We also recognized through those surveys and looking at the respondents, those organizations, right? We talk about those big organizations. A lot of those staffers were the ones responding. And so we knew right away we were going to face a challenge of having the production and processing sectors represented.
So we have another question that asks, there's a group that's trying to engage the ag community, and they're scared off by the word policy. So it's deterring them from bringing that issue to the FPC. Do you have strategies to encourage that community to bring issues forward?
I have a couple of ideas. I don't know if to think more about ag community specifically, but certainly in public health, we talk about policy from a policy, systems, and environment perspective. And so it's not just what maybe is the resonance around policy is government. And I think the breakdown and understanding that what we're trying to do is shift the context that we operate within, that we could describe it a little bit and invite them to be change makers, or invite them to be part of the necessary groups that shape the conversation for changing the context. And that policy is just one strategy. And I can speak with assurance that even though these are all called food policy councils, that we're all looking at everything from labels in grocery stores or in schools to social marketing promotion, to changing the settings and the context that people make decisions within, that those are as attractive to a lot of these councils as city-related resolutions and things like that. So, there could be a broader conversation amongst all of us around that. If policy is the most accurate term anymore, it certainly doesn't limit what we do. So I think I would invite you and encourage all of us to be creative in speaking about the intent behind it. And because that's why we're doing the work is the purpose. And policy is just one mechanism to get there.
Do you have anything to
I definitely agree. I've mentioned, we've been struggling with this ourselves, right? The one group that we have been able to maintain their activity is our farmers market community. And some of them are market gardeners. So they sell the products they grow. And one of their motivations is that the farmers market is located in a neighborhood and they want to impact that neighborhood. And so although we may use the word policy, right, Monica, we try to spin it, I guess, twist it a little bit so that we're we'll just focus on the grandmother who has, who's raising her grandkids. And our SNAP and Center program can help that mother or that caregiver be able to feed her children in a healthier way. So we probably don't use the word policy with our farmers market people as much. And if we do, I think we frame it around helping diversify their bottom line, right, and their profit streams, which is always a carrot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you. So the next question is for Rachel. Could you speak some to the interaction of food policy councils? Do you know if councils are going to others for help, to give advice, or even cooperate?
So this is a question we constantly are thinking about here at the Food Policy Networks Project, and that I also explored in my thesis a little bit. I think it varies greatly depending on the council. There are a lot of groups that are intimately connected to other councils in their state, especially aided by the fact that a lot of states now have networks that convene the local councils. So Minnesota, Michigan, North Carolina, Kansas, California, there's over 30 states now that have some form of convening network. So we've seen that in those states, councils are much more likely to be talking to each other just because they have spaces to do that in. But there's also groups talking to one another across the country, sometimes through networks like FPN, and there's other similar networks like related to, if you're working specifically in sustainable government work, there's a sustainability directors network has a subgroup. There's public health networks that have subgroups that work on food policy work. So there's a lot of different networks where groups are talking to one another. I think some just send out a question on listserv and hear back when other councils answer regarding that question. And then there are probably others that don't really talk at all to other councils. And sometimes we can't even communicate with them as part of the National Food Policy Networks Project. We have a hard time getting in touch. So it really varies, but there are some that are starting to work together, trying to collaborate on some higher levels of policy. I know in North Carolina, they put together a submission. I don't know the official term, and I don't think I saw anyone from North Carolina on the call, but they put something together that was presented around the Farm Bill recently, And they sent out a press release about that. And there's a few other councils that are working on state level work, trying to, at the local level, affect state policy that affects all of their councils. So it really varies greatly across the country.
Nicole, do you all collaborate with other food policy councils?
So in Ohio, we have a few locally based food policy coalitions councils, and then we have an Ohio Food Policy Network. So the Ohio Food Policy Network is when we take advantage of that time to meet and discuss and collaborate with other coalitions.
Thank you. So there's another question, and I'm not really sure how to answer it, but it's, I'd like to see if you all have an opinion. The question is there a certain scale where FPCs seem to be more sustainable? And then there's a follow-up to that, thinking about local versus county versus regional versus statewide. Is there a sweet spot in a geographic context?
Rachel, I think you guys would answer that best.
I don't think we have an answer for that. I think that's what we're trying to learn to figure out, is what is that sweet spot? Where is it, and what works to make a council sustainable? And it helps to have shared experiences from you all talking about what are the lessons learned, what have you seen that helps to make them sustainable. I think one of the things is that that we're learning is the flexibility of councils. So don't be rigid in your structure, and don't be rigid in kind of what you set out as your priorities, that they're always going to be the same. Those will change as your membership changes, as your relevancy changes, as your work changes, as the political context that you work in changes. And so having some flexibility and ability to adapt and change as your situation changes helps to maintain that sustainability.
I feel like I would echo that in saying that it might not be the structure, governance, or geography that creates the sustainability, but it's more the approach that you take to the work. And thinking about this something that's used in systems change work a lot is the developmental evaluation approach that sets up the structure for reflective learning and continuous learning, so that essentially you're not creating strategic plans, you're creating roadmaps. And you're constantly updating and changing them as the broader context shifts around you. So you can start wherever, but the sustainable piece about starting and then continuing is constantly asking questions about what's happening around you and what is going to help you be sustainable. And that's not going to be static. So how do you build in that commitment and process at the onset that maybe 6 years down the road you decide that it should be one municipality and you should go statewide, or then maybe you're going to scale back and go county, and then you're going to go national, or whatever that might look like.
Great point. Thank you. I like the part of it, continuing to ask questions and calling it a roadmap and not a strategy.
Yeah.
Noel Harden says that the Cass County Food Policy Council works across 7 jurisdictions, that it is part of a comparative advantage in their work. Is a statewide food policy council able to, I'm curious if a statewide food policy council in Minnesota would be workable or sustainable considering the size and variation across our state. Yeah.
Where is Cass Clay?
It's on the border. It's on the border of Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minneapolis.
Okay.
Minnesota, sorry. So it straddles 2 states, as well as it looks like a local jurisdiction.
Okay.
I think that's one thing that we've noticed when you were asking the earlier question about, is there one sweet spot across different types of food policy councils? I think the size of the U.S. and the difference in size of states and counties and regions can make it quite challenging, because you can have really small states like Rhode Island that it is functioning at a state level, but Rhode Island's so small that it would be almost the size of a multi-county regional council out in other parts of the country. And so I think a lot of the approaches that we learn from these different areas have to be so context specific that we can learn from how people are doing things, but we'll have to definitely adapt it to the local conditions that you're in.
Yeah. We're also seeing, which is an interesting development, is this evolution in terms of at a more statewide level, that there's been food policy councils, but then there's a network council that comes up too. So there are these two entities in a state that work together, one kind of really focused on policy and the other one working with the local councils, kind of bringing them together and elevating that voice. And so there's a few states that have that model, which I think is helping to kind of bridge this gap in terms of meeting policy needs and also meeting local needs.
Cool.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll close out. I want to say thank you all so much. Thank you, Nicole, Monica, and Rachel for presenting and sharing your insights and wisdom. It's been a wonderful conversation and wonderful to hear lessons learned. We will be sharing the recording and slides with everyone, even those that did not attend but registered. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.